Hello, my name is Robert Teester and I've been a psychotherapist for over 36 years and a meditation teacher since 2001. Today's talk is on Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. All my talks cover some aspect of modern psychology and they're under the title of the Cultivation of Wisdom. Now, when Carl Jung talked about the collective unconscious, he would talk about it in terms of the mythology of a culture and how the culture influenced the individual, and that it was difficult to understand because it was not available in the conscious mind. It was the collective unconscious, and he talked a lot about archetypal types of energies that were available to the person from that particular culture and from that particular myth. It was a collective, transcendental sort of wisdom that was guiding mankind, and this is the language that he used to talk about that. But I'm going to talk more about the shadow side of the collective unconscious. Although there are really good things about the collective unconscious as a concept, but there are shadow sides that are difficult to work with. Let's say on the archetypal structures, there's always a shadow side of these things, and in each culture, in mythology, every culture has this shadow material that also comes as we're born into the culture, comes into our psyche from this unconscious collective. And what I'm talking about is the wounded part of a culture too. It isn't just about these wonderful archetypes, then you can assume them and do great things with them, you know, like the warrior or the king or the queen or the magician or the lover. That kind of archetypal energy, of course, is very romantic in some ways and very attractive. But the point of this talk today is to talk about the wounded side of a collective unconscious coming from a particular myth or background. Each person has a different one, but we all inherit a wounded side, unconscious side that is holding us back. It's common in psychology today to talk about being conscious as one, like an iceberg, like 1/8 of the iceberg is at the surface of the water and can be seen, but that 7/8 of it is under the water. So that's a good way to think about consciousness versus subconscious material or unconscious material, and then also the collective unconscious material that's part of this culture itself. Today, with modernity, we bring in with us our heritage, going back many generations of people, and sometimes they're different cultures. Sometimes a man and a woman will be from different countries. Let's say from Europe, they're coming. One's from France, one's from Germany. And they get married, or whatever country we're talking about. Everybody's bringing that to the table in a way, because they're bringing the collective unconscious into the relationship also, not just what they consciously want, but the subconscious material, the unconscious material, and the collective unconscious material comes into it too. And these things come up out of the depths and can be very upsetting. They're very powerful, and we can gain a lot of valuable insights in looking into the shadow side of the collective unconscious. People that are in relationships oftentimes try to decide or make a map of the direction their relationship is going in, and also their lives that are going in a certain direction, and that's a conscious kind of thing to do. Okay, we want it to go here, but it rarely does what we want it to do. Somehow everything keeps changing on us, and where are all these energies coming from? And my suggestion here is that a lot of it is coming out of the collective unconscious. A good example of this is the process of healing from a war that we've been involved with. Different cultures have different wars, and they leave imprints, they leave wounds, emotional scarring, psychic wounding. Psychic energies get damaged, or lives get so damaged, and this stuff is so difficult to work with. So let's just say, for example, there's so many wars to pick from, but let's talk about the biggest one there was, and that was World War II. We're still living in the shadow of World War II. It's affecting our lives every day. In that war, they don't really know how many people were killed or died, but the numbers that come up routinely are 70 to 80 million people, and most of them were civilians. I think roughly 2/3 of them were civilians. So everybody lost somebody in World War II. It was a world war, and it affected everyone on some level, whether someone died or they fought in it or they had a spouse or family member. It was a big event. And how do you heal from something like that? So if you look at the videos of how these families and cultures and societies recovered from that, well, they just started breaking up the bricks and build a new building with them and bury the people and so forth. But the emotional damage and the psychological issues under the surface are staggering. And that goes into the collective unconscious. That's so massive that people just go into survival mode for the longest time after an episode like that concludes. They go on, they move from the war economy to the civil domestic economy, and they just start moving from that kind of lifestyle to more of a domestic lifestyle where the family is the center of somebody's life and people get married. Marriage was very difficult during the war. There was these relationships, long-term relationships, and people rarely saw each other. Somebody was shipped overseas and may or may not have been killed, but they weren't around, and so the family structure was undermined, and the war economy moved in, and it was a lot of survival kind of energy and a lot of anxiety and a lot of loss, tremendous loss for almost everyone, because everyone knew people that were killed or died somehow. And a lot of people don't even know what happened, because so many people died through artillery, through bombing and so forth, and people just disappeared, they vaporized. And so that's even a deeper problem for people to overcome, because it's just the unknown. Well, they never came home kind of thing, where what happened to them, we don't know, but so many people like the unknown soldier kind of concept, where they don't know what happened, and so they just put a concept on it like that and put a grave of representing all of those men and women and children too. So I'm saying this because I want you to understand the idea of the collective unconscious, that there's so much material in there. That's like a big part of the iceberg that's under the water, is this collective unconscious. It isn't just about who your father was and where he was from, and then who your mother was and where she was from. They bring that into the relationship, each of them with them, but then you can go back again and stack it up. And so where was your mother's parents from? Well, the father was from somewhere and the mother was from somewhere else. See, we don't marry in our family, of course, we marry someone else. And then your father would have a mother and father, and they were both from different places too, different families. They could have been in the same culture, they could have been in different countries, they might not have spoke the same language. That's very common in people coming to America, but because we're a melting pot nation. But this is the way it is for everyone on some level, that whoever gets married, it isn't just about their history. They're bringing this collective unconscious into the relationship with them. And this material tends to drive people. They get activated by this material that's under the surface. Let's say there was a lot of loss, and then when in their relationship, loss is an issue for them, and they don't want people leaving them, and in relationship, and they don't want to get a divorce, or they drink too much, or whatever goes on with this anxiety and this loss. It's coming out of the collective unconscious. And so Jung was right to identify this, because this is on a level of myth that we don't track. We can track in a therapy session a person's parents and what they were like, and if they were wounded, which they were, and psychological issues came up, and whatever comes up. But it's sometimes very difficult to nail it down where it comes from, because the father might say, well, I got it from my father. Well, where'd he get it from? Well, blah, blah. It goes on back like that. And there's always this cycle of, we could say violence, but there's these wars that continually come up from the historical perspective. Talk to any historian about war. It isn't just that we had World War I and II. The wars go on between human beings routinely. And historians are the ones that track this, and they become specialists in a certain culture, or certain myth, or certain time period. And each one of them has wars going on, whether it's Asia or Europe or United States, whatever. So we are a predatory species, and we routinely have wars to resolve our issues. And there's nothing more important than trying to resolve them today, because we have so many human beings. The more human beings you have, things can get out of hand. People want more space, and they try to take it. So that creates wars and territorial acting out and so forth. But this comes out of the collective unconscious to do it like that, because people have always done it like that. Maybe back to caveman days, The collective unconscious goes way back, and the human species has a certain pattern of behavior. And being predators, we have that instinct too, just like animals who kill one another to eat one another. Human beings also do the same thing. They don't, eat each other, but they can kill people and take their property, that kind of a thing. And this happens pretty routinely in war. There's a lot of that kind of energy and that kind of behavior. So it's a vast kind of concept that we're broaching here, and I know it's difficult to track on it, because we want to know why we are the way we are. But this really throws a curveball into the whole thing when you talk about the myths of a culture and how we ended up the way we have. So I'm going to change gears a little bit, because I wanted to set the table first to give you some examples of the vastness of the collective unconscious and what that means for you today. As a therapist, our job in a way is to take people over into their shadow material. And when people do that, they typically weep. They have a lot of grief under the surface. The daily life, they don't see that so much. They're busy. But they're also, in a way, very distracted from looking deeper into themselves. Psychotherapists see this routinely. Every client has this kind of material this emotional, psychological material under the surface. And we have to turn our gaze inwardly to start looking at that kind of material. Each one of us has to do some of that in order to deepen our awareness of what's happening in our life. Otherwise, we tend to just skip on the surface of the water like a stone that's thrown, and it skips, across the lake. But it's more important to try to find some depth. That's where you will get your clarity. That's where you get your visions from. You get your fundamental understanding of who you are from these depths. But we mentioned Carl Jung's looking at this collective unconscious, but also Joseph Campbell was very succinct and did a really fine job synthesizing all the religions and the myths of the cultures by talking about how his book was called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and what he was saying was that we tried to turn our gaze inwardly, heroically, to enlighten ourselves. And we run into all of this anguish that's inside, all this unbearability, all these feelings that are tangled up in there. And we have to go into this material to a degree to start straightening some of it out. Rather than skipping on the surface of the water, we start going deeper into this kind of feeling state. The anguish is there for a reason, and it's unbearable. And if we can breathe into that part, if we have a part of our life that takes time to breathe into this unbearable side of ourselves, we will get more clarity about who we are, and we tend not to want to hurt each other when we do that kind of work, because we have seen directly how we've been hurt by others. The pain that people carry is typically not self-inflicted. It is coming from the culture, coming from parents from a different or a certain period of time. In the old days, it was common for people to hit each other, hit their children with a belt or a stick or something like that, you see. Now that damaged children. It's not. Some people say, oh, that was helpful because I was such a naughty child, but that's not really the case. There are much better ways of parenting. But in the old days, there was a lot of survival energy, and you had to buck up and just do what you had to do, things to make the family survive, and the kids had to pitch in. But education is better in teaching children. A good parent is always a good teacher, explaining what they want, and then also not so much punishment, but leading them to a level of understanding. So what I'm trying to get at is that it's up to each person to decide if they're going to work with this material. Because as a therapist, what I see is that most people don't. Most people have no idea how wounded they are. And that's denial, but that's the mainstream. Because most people, are working. They're working, 40 plus hours a week. If you're working a 40-hour job, that's about 50 to 60 hours really, because you have to, wake up at a certain time and get something to eat and shower and blah, blah, go to work, come back, and you're exhausted and you want to get something to eat, and then, it just takes your whole day. So where's time to the luxury of going inside and working with this kind of material? So most people aren't going to do that, and that's just the way that it is. I wish I could change it, but I can't. But I can give talks like this to remind people that this is vital for each of us to do this kind of work, so that we do something meaningful with our life. And so we turn the gaze inwardly, and then what we find, as Joe Campbell's hero, is a lot of difficulty going into this kind of material. And if we do some work inside, as the hero does in Campbell's books and his stories, the hero finds some real valuable insight into himself. He struggles to find it, but he does find it. And then the hero comes back out of the depths, and what he says is bringing back the boon. That's how it's talked about in the mythological stories. He's bringing back the boon. He's bringing back this insight about himself, and then an insight about other people, hopefully. Because as the poets do, the poets are writing about things that are under the surface. They're writing about things that are just out of our line of sight. They're writing about inner material. The poets are writing about things that can't be written about. So that's their dilemma. How do I express what I see down in these depths? And then put words to it. And that's our attraction to poetry, is like, oh, I sort of get a sense of what they're saying. You know, this poet really speaks to me. I can hear what he's saying. And what we're trying to do, ultimately, in all of these different religions and all these different journeys that we can get on the inner level, it's always the same thing. We're just trying to open our heart back up. Our heart, it gets closed. We get so shut down by the swirl of modernity. We lose ourselves, and we feel lost, and we like look around, like, where am I at? Is this what I wanted to do with my life? And when you started out setting your goals when you were a teenager and so forth, you had a certain, thing that you wanted to do. But did your life actually turn out that way? It's pretty rare. But having a spiritual aspect to your life, having a way of going inwardly, will clarify many levels for you. There are a multitude. We're such multi-dimensional people. So when we turn inwardly, we might open up to the next level down, which is, of course, what we do, because you can't go to the second level without going to the first one. So we go in, and we can maybe find something painful about our childhood, and we talk about that, and then instead of becoming a victim, after a while, if you're talking to your therapist routinely, instead of being a victim, which is what we feel initially, we become a survivor of our childhood experiences. And we use that to help ourselves develop into an adult person, an authentic person, rather than a closet frightened person. So that's how we can grow up emotionally. See, we're working internally on emotional material and psychological concept material, where we're trying to go into the depths, and we hit these conflicts, we hit these painful things, we hit these tight spots that we are uncomfortable with. And so you have to be willing to work with this difficult material and this anguish that everybody has, and not run from it. This time when you're in a therapy session and your therapist is holding a sacred container for you to go into that material where you're supported and helped, the therapist goes with you. So that's what's so helpful about it. You'll tackle bigger problems with a mentor with you, and that's part of what a therapist does, is go with you into that stuff so that you can heal it. And then you heal that, and you grow up a bit at a time. It's one step at a time. And then you go to the next step after you've completed that level. You see, so it's like that. You go back in age when you start working internally. On the emotional level, you go backwards in age. Whatever's bugging you at such and such an age, you work with that until you clear that up, and then you go into the next level if you keep working. So And at some point you might want to stop, because you may not be finished, but you just want to stop, like, okay, I need a breather because it's getting a little too hot. That means you're going into younger material, and the younger you go, the hotter it gets. Because there's no words. So you see, when you're really young into yourself deeply, before you had language, it's hard to even talk about it because you didn't have words then. You might have pictures, you might have symbols, you might have something you remembered, but it was vague, and you have to really work hard in childhood and early childhood to piece together the jigsaw puzzle, because that's sort of what it's like. But just like a jigsaw puzzle, if you snap in enough pieces, then you can start seeing larger and larger patterns in your life, and you feel better because now it's in consciousness and you understand, and you're not a victim anymore, but you're a survivor of it, and you go, oh, that's what happened to me. Everybody has things that happen to them, but they get going so fast in their adult life that they just don't remember anymore. But there are a few that put their hand up and they say, okay, I'm going to get in therapy and I'm going to work this stuff through as best I can until it becomes so unbearable I just can't do it anymore. But just take one step at a time and let the rest of it just unfold by itself. So some of the anguish, the point I'm just trying to get through is that some of this anguish maybe isn't your parents per se, it's the collective unconscious of the culture. And oftentimes some cultures go into war. One leader becomes a big part of a country, and he starts a war with another leader next door, and then you're a soldier now, or you're a wife and supporting the culture and helping defeat this person. So everybody's got this in their collective unconscious. So there is anguish that gets built up over decades and millennium. You see this frequently, like in Europe. They have distinct countries, but they remember, historically, that they were at war with this country back in the 1400s, and land was taken, and and then something happened in the 1500s, and then something in the various wars go on, over these kinds of incidences, and they remembered, and people are angry still. Sometimes they're angry, they don't even know why. But if you go into their history, they can see why their father was angry and why their grandfather was, blah, blah, like that. But that's in part of the collective unconscious, because that's a cultural thing. It's so massive, it's so big. And so there are levels of anguish that are like that come out of the depths, and that sometimes you don't even have a picture or a name for it, but it's a feeling. And you don't necessarily need to name it, but you can feel it. Feeling is more important than naming it. That's just following the grief. There are certain types of therapy called grief work, and I'm a real proponent of it, because if you follow your grief, you can trust that. The grief never lies. It's like you go into the grief and there might be tears and some weeping, some real deep feeling of anguish in there. But you don't know why it's there. That's fine, as long as you keep going. You see, you move into that material, and then if you keep working with it, don't try to make a big story out of it. It isn't. It just distracts you, really. It's braver to go into it and keep going into it until you work it through. And at the backside, when you're sort of stepping away from this period, you will get an image. Oh, that's what that was. I was 4 years old when that happened. You see, 5 years old. It's like that. And you find out the parents broke up, and there was a divorce when you were young, and and then all of a sudden you had a loss because you lost either your father or your mother. And why does that happen? Well, he had issues, but this is part of the collective unconscious. He might have been unstable. He came from a family that wasn't that was also unstable, and so forth. Like, in a sense, in keeping with the story that I was mentioning, but let's say your grandfather came back from the war. And he never talked to anybody about it. And so he was silent, and he just stayed silent, and he maintained himself by alcohol. But today, people talk more about that kind of thing. Like post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the biggest diagnoses that we have in the DSM catalog of mental disorders. And that didn't exist, when people in World War II, as early as World War II, it was called shell shock, it was called something. But it was severe anxiety, of course, that post-traumatic stress disorder encapsulates all that. When you had a bad experience, you had a car accident, that's post-traumatic stress. And you walk around with that stuff in there, and you're trying to, stay sane, but it's bubbling and boiling in there. So you have to go into that material to calm it down. And you need to take a trained professional with you when you do it, because you're going to jump out of there. And a therapist will help you to take one little piece of it at a time. You don't have to do it all at one time. You do it over a period of X number of months, whatever the issue is. If those guys from World War II that were in combat had therapists to come back to and talk their way with that material, it would have changed their life completely. They didn't do that. And if you see on these programs, YouTube or TV, that talk to these old veterans, when they start talking about the war, they oftentimes start weeping. They're still carrying that. They shouldn't be carrying that still. They should, from a mental health point of view, as a therapist, get them in therapy as soon as possible. And the VA today has much more mental health available than back then. Back then, people would shame you for being shell-shocked. And there was a famous incident where General Patton went into a medical tent, and the guy was trembling there in the bed, and Patton slapped him, slapped a couple of them, and Eisenhower pulled him out of duty and put him somewhere on a desk job, because he was shaming people that were emotionally wounded. Now today, of course, he'd probably be released. But Eisenhower needed him to go back into and help fight the Germans, so he was later put back into the war and did heroic things and help in that war. So that's how psychology has changed. It wasn't seen as a legitimate gripe or wounding or disorder. And so when the guys got out of the military after that war, they didn't talk much about it. And that's true. That's true for Vietnam. It was true for Korea. It's true, for this modern war too. But there's a lot more therapists available through the VA for them to join groups and talk to therapists about that kind of thing. So we're learning as we go. But I want to understand that war is part of that collective unconscious. The United States has a really large warrior class. Some countries don't have a large warrior class like soldiers, like Switzerland doesn't. Costa Rica, I don't think does. But they're vulnerable because people could take them over, So it isn't that we shouldn't have a warrior class, because humans are predators and you might get attacked. And so it's a dilemma. It's an existential kind of dilemma. What do you do? Well, we do have wars, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. And so, and there's lots of different kinds of wars. There's wars where you're shooting and, bombing and so forth, the obvious ones. But there's war between people. Neighbors can be at war for a long time. They hate each other. They don't like each other, and whatever goes on. There's war it can be war in a marriage. There's a power struggle in the marriage, and all kinds of things are done to harm the other person. And it destroys the intimacy, but the marriage stays and goes on like this. But it isn't safe at deeper levels, and so you need a place to heal. You need a place to work with this kind of material. So I encourage people to do some inner work and to remember that how vital it is for you to do this. It's on 3 levels, emotional, psychological, and spiritual, that we need to turn the gaze inwardly and work with whatever material you have. Every person decides, that they want to do this work, and then they turn their gaze inwardly, and whatever unfolds for them. You don't necessarily need to know why to start, because it will unfold in sessions by itself. And then when that session is over, you leave, it wraps itself up, and then you go back to work and back to your family and so forth. So you balance it out. It isn't like you have to do all of that, right away and then not do anything else. Inner work is a piece in your basket of things that you do. That's a piece in your basket. Okay, Thursday I see my therapist. And then and the point of it isn't to see a therapist. The point is to do inner work so that you deepen and get a clearer vision, understanding, insights into yourself. And when you do that, you tend to have insights about other people, because humans aren't different. We're not all different, really. If you're a therapist, and as long as I've been, you see that everybody's the same. Their wound might be, zigging left, and then the other one's zigging right, but zigging left, and then the other one zagging. Everybody's wrestling with this anguish. Let's say everybody's filled up. Everybody's got a lot of anguish, and they have a hard time dealing with these things that are unbearable for them. So when you've got a really good therapist to help you work with something that's unbearable, you can work it through. You're not going to do that on your own, believe me. You can do a little of it, but under the surface there's a lot of this stuff. It generally takes 3 to 4 years to work a good chunk of this out of there, to where you don't go down the same path that you've been going. You actually do change directions to that will serve you better, instead of making the same mistakes over and over and over. If you're in a pattern that you're making these mistakes over and over, it means that something's really wrong. And it's probably in the unconscious. Some of it's in the subconscious, but you don't know it until you work with it. And then when you do work on this material, this emotional and psychological material, and spiritual too, then your life changes, and you don't go down that road again, that same one that you fall in a hole. You do something else. Let's say you're really angry. Well, when you work on the stuff that's underneath the anger, the pain, you stop reacting so strongly to whoever. You don't get so angry. And matter of fact, you don't get angry at all. You see that where it's coming from is, a wounded place. You've been in that place, and you're not a victim now. You're a survivor of that pain, and you are proactive rather than reactive. Big difference. Big difference in how you behave, and the walk you walk, and the direction you take, and the map you draw. You can stick to it better. But you want, more intimate life, and more loving in your life, and more caring, and things like that. A deeper person feels that intuitively. If you shut down enough, you don't feel anything. You just go numb. So you have to recover yourself. In spite of the capitalistic, competitive world. Now, in your job, you need some armoring, but in your home life, in your intimate life, in your inner life, you can be open. And that's what happens when you go inside. You have, a private you, and you have insights into who you are deeply. And you can share that with people that you trust. But it's most important that you share with yourself first. And that's what therapy is about, is opening parts of yourself up, opening your heart in a deeper way, and that reverses the shutting down. And you start becoming more human, more loving, more caring. And you wouldn't, and especially, it's really important if you have children, but it's always important. But children are are the first recipients of your inner work, because you're more loving to them too. Because you saw how you were wounded, and you don't want to wound your own children the same way you were wounded, which is how parents typically act out. So it will change their life, and it will change your friends, and it will change, everything for the better. If you're willing to go into some of this anguish, and some of the unbearable material, it's vital to do that. And even if you don't know what it is, don't think that you need to know. Most people actually don't know. And that's what therapy is about, is unfolding into the known, from the unknown feeling of something that's wrong, and you feel that out, and you open up to that, and you become, one step more whole that way. You work on it. So it's step by step like that. People always want it to go so fast and so forth, but it isn't like that. You can't really rush that. It unfolds by itself. So this is a talk about the different levels of this unconscious material and how vast it really is. That each culture has a collective unconscious. It isn't the same one. If you're in a certain country, they have one, and another country has another one, and you go over to Asia, and China's got this immense history, and Japan has this strong traditions, but everybody's got a collective unconscious, and so when they go inside, they're working with their own stuff like that, and so it bleeds over into this vastness. And you can work with that. It isn't an unknown. It's something that therapists work with on a daily basis. They start out, small with your family and your parents, and then you can go into deeper stuff. The deeper you go, the vaster it gets like that. And you become more wise when you do that. This talk is part of the series called the Cultivation of Wisdom. So all these talks are aimed at opening up, cultivating wisdom in your life so that you become a wise person. It's so rare to find one these days. I mean, you can find rich people all over, but that's not wisdom. That's a different animal altogether. You can have a lot of money. You can be a real predator out there in the corporate world and make a lot of money, but you might just be a really greedy, angry warrior type person that does that. Wisdom is not the same thing. Wisdom is doing inner work and getting deeper and deeper insights into this human experience that we're having here. And healing from these wounds. When you heal from the wounds, you become more and more you, the real human being that you are. And it's a very different way of being. So I want to encourage everybody to think about these things that I'm saying, and try to put together your own plan. Find somebody that can help you. Do some work. Do some inner work. And I encourage you to go to my YouTube channel called The Cultivation of Wisdom. My name is Robert Teester, and I have a whole series of talks on some aspect of modern psychology in there. And listen to these talks. I'm putting them up for free. The intention is to try to help people stop suffering. And all the talks are aimed at that, and they're all saying the same thing in a little different way so that people can hear them. Some talks people don't hear, and some talks they do. So listen carefully to the talks and get the help that you need, and I support you 100% in that. So thank you for listening, and I wish you well.